Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about converting Pokemon characters into Greyplains characters. Very exciting stuff. I'm excited. Are you excited? You're excited. So, a brief introduction to me. My name is Jacob Haines. I am the lead designer of Greyplains, which is a tabletop role-playing game. My resume, so to speak, is on the screen, so I feel my credentials speak for themselves. So, what is Greyplains, you might be asking? As I mentioned, it is a tabletop role-playing game. If you've ever heard of Dungeons & Dragons, it's like that. Greyplains is obviously not Dungeons & Dragons. It's different. One of the major key differences about it is that instead of rolling a d20 to make your actions, you have a proficiency going from generally 0 to 16, and from that you have different dice that you roll and different flat modifiers that you add in order to see whether or not you succeed or fail at a certain action. So now that you know what Greyplains is, I guess it's time to talk about what Pokemon is. I think you know what Pokemon is. Pokemon is such a large and big tent franchise that I think it's really important that I talk about what I mean by converting a Pokemon into a Greyplains character. And what I mean is that I'm converting competitive Pokemon as they are in Pokemon Showdown, administered by Smogon, in generally 6v6 singles. The way it works is that most Pokemon are viable within their own respective tiers. The power level of the Pokemon is determined generally by its usage in the different power levels, so the more used it is in the common standard of play, which is overused, generally indicates that it's a better Pokemon. But, you know, things like Lanoon are still going to be played in lower tiers, and they're going to be quite good there. Some Pokemon are just universally going to be bad, like Spinarak and Ariados. There's no coming back for them. I'm sorry. As far as and I suppose we, are concerned, a Pokemon, for being converted into a Greyplains character, has two fundamental elements. It has its stats, which are its, like, literal, objective statistical points. And it also has a role, which includes what you might consider statistical points, like the exact moves it learns, the ability that it has, and its type, but also includes more kind of contextual information about tiers, about what it does in the tier, things like that. And we'll get more into that as we go. So when we actually convert the Pokemon to a Greyplains character, the stats are going to go into the character's abilities and level. The abilities generally judge how good the character is at certain basic concepts of the game, and the level is like how totally powerful they are. And then the roles are going to convert it into what are called character elements. So that'll be like their species, the different fighting styles, different class archetype flavor, things like that. So the first thing we're going to start with is stats. Stats are really easy to convert. It's pretty simple, straightforward baseline information. We'll just be able to plug and chuck it just by converting a few numbers over. So a Pokemon has 6 stats, as well as a base stat total, giving it a total of 7 objective elements that we're going to be converting into the 7 abilities and total level of a character in Greyplains. The conversion for them you can see on both sides. The right column is the Greyplains abilities column, as well as the level. And on the left side is the various stats, as well as the base stat total, just called total from Bulbapedia, and showing kind of where they go and how they translate to each other. Presence isn't occupied by a stat. We're going to use their tier, the Pokemon's tier, so we'll talk about that later going forward. So Greyplains has 7 abilities. There's a precedent in tabletop game design of explaining your abilities with tomatoes. So for Greyplains, how it goes. This is just to get an overview, quick glance of, like, kind of visualizing how the ability works in game. So power, how many tomatoes can you carry? Agility, your ability to avoid throwing tomatoes. Coordination, your ability to throw tomatoes. Awareness, not putting tomatoes into a fruit salad. Intellect, knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Presence is convincing someone to eat the tomato fruit salad. And luck is how cheap the tomatoes were at the store, because obviously if they were cheaper, you can get more tomatoes. In Greyplains, when generating a character, they can have an ability score range between -2 and 4. You can roll, if you're doing rolling, you can roll as low as a -3 and a 5, but as the bottom bullet explains, those actually convert back to -2 and 4 respectively. You just get an additional level 0 slot. We'll talk about that later. -2, obviously, is bad, and 4 is good. So when you're making a character, you want to try to get as close to 4 on all your abilities as possible, I guess, in theory, if you want a power game. There are multiple ways to generate ability scores in Greyplains. Typically, I recommend that parties use point buy so that everybody is numerically fair. But in Pokemon, all Pokemon are not numerically fair. You know, Ariados has to compete with Mewtwo as a fully evolved Pokemon. So there's some degrees of variance for ability score ranges represented here. So the method that is assumed to be used for generating the Pokemon, it's like as if that person making that Greyplains Pokemon character was rolling 1d6 and subtracting 1d4 to generate the result. Pokemon has a much wider range of stats than Greyplains does. Instead of -2 to 4, a Pokemon will have anywhere between 5 to up to Gen 3, 152 or something like that. So, a lot wider range. Being considered to have a good stat is around 100. There's a couple of critical benchmarks and comparison Pokemon that reach 100 in their stat that is just good enough to be what they do. HP is a really solid example. 100 HP is just enough with maximum IVs and maximum EVs that you have 404 hit points at level 100, which means that you have just enough hit points to have 101 HP substitutes, which is really important to survive moves like Seismic Toss, especially, and Nightshade, secondarily. For your attack and special attack, 100 is good enough to get things done. 100 base attack Earthquake and 100 base special attack Thunderbolt applied to the right target can really mess up a lot of things. For your defenses, 100 special and physical defense is good enough to be able to solidly take most neutral hits and take basically nothing from resisted hits. You might still be vulnerable to special hits or super effective hits, but even then, depending on how good your HP is, it may not even be that bad. And 100 speed is the absolute benchmark, with the exception of maybe Gen 1, where it might be considered 95. 100 is the minimum requirement to be considered fast. There's a lot of Pokemon that are exactly 100 speed, and so being able to at least speed tie other fast Pokemon is essential to being a good offensive, and even in many cases, a very good defensive Pokemon. If 100 is the requirement to be considered to have a good stat, then it raises the question of what is the range for a bad stat. They can go as low as absolutely 1 in the case of Shedinza's HP. The worst stats in the game other than that are hovering at around 5, being Shuckle Speed and Chansey's attack. Generally speaking, the threshold to have a usable or like okay stat is around 70. A good example of a Pokemon that has 70 in a stat that is considered quite usable and helpful is Gen 1 Tauros' Special, which is a special attack and special defense in Gen 1. With 70 special, he has a relatively potent Blizzard, which helps him cover his matchup against Rhydon, which takes very little damage from Body Slam, Hyper Beam, and even the super effective Earthquake kind of bounces off of Rhydon. But a 70 base Blizzard does quite a lot of damage to Rhydon. You can also, in theory, use things like Fire Blast, and if you're a Mad Lad, Thunder, or I guess Thunderbolt, but those are less commonly ran than Blizzard, which is considered the standard. So, in the making of this video, I was trying to see what the overall average for stats was, just to kind of confirm that what I was thinking was 70 is about the baseline for, like, average and okay. And it turns out somebody had already calculated it for me, so thanks Floating Bullet Indigo Floating Bullet on Pokemon database in the year 2017 for figuring it out for me. So we got some pretty interesting numbers here. Overall takeaway being that 70 is indeed about average, considering the average stat for all Pokemon is about 70. I do think that 66.6 speed is funny, not because 666 haha funny number, but because this was calculated for Gen 7, so all Pokemon going up to Gen 7, I think the average speed was tanked by like at least a couple points in Gen 7 because of how slow all the Pokemon are in Gen 7. So I think that's pretty funny. And these are just stats for not including mega evolutions. I included the sources both to this webpage and also to the sources that Indigo used to calculate it from Bulba Garden in the description. So if you want to check it out, you can. So now we know what the range of bad, average, and good are. We can start actually really thinking about converting those into Greyplains numbers. So on a scale of -2 to 4, up to and including -3, which is -2 plus 1 level 0 slot, and 5 being 4 plus 1 level 0 slot. At the lowest possible range is 1 to 30. If you have a 30 in a stat or less, that's just like, it's abysmal. It's like supposed to be extremely unusable. It's like bad on purpose. Like, it's not just because it's a weak Pokemon, a little baby. It's because it's designed to be terrible. So you're going to be compensated for that in some other way, in this case being having a bonus level 0 slot. From there, you can kind of just see through what's going on there. The reason why for 4 plus 1 level 0 slot is cut off at 136 is that Pokemon like Tyranitar have like around either 134 or 135 attack, something like that. And so other Pokemon have like right up there where it's like very, very, very good, but it's not like game-breakingly good. You know, it's not like they're the strongest hitter in the game with 135 attack. They just are like really, really solid with that amount of attack. There are Pokemon that exceed that. Something like Groudon, Kyogre, and Mewtwo. Stuff like that. Instead of a stat, we're going to use the Pokemon's tier for determining their presence ability. So, as you can see on the left, these are the standard tiers. So, anything that is banned from overuse, which is the standard tier, is considered an Uber's Pokemon. So, this is like where the big boys live. This is like Groudon, Kyogre, Mewtwo, things like that are just obviously grossly overpowered. This is what is important to understand is that Ubers isn't a tier that's explicitly just for legendary Pokemon. There are plenty of quote-unquote legendary Pokemon that fit just fine in OU or even in lower tiers. Things like Zapdos is an overused staple. Things like Articuno are just kind of typically not very good, and so they end up even in the lower tiers, despite being technically a legendary Pokemon. Overused the standard area of play, and then they go down in power level from that. Pokemon are generally put into tiers by their usage, and so that's kind of why we're aligning it to presence. Presence as an ability. It's like your character's likability, an ability to convince people of things. So the idea of applying usability kind of as an idea of like how popular, quote unquote, the Pokemon is, in kind of like a more objective sense that we can actually see their exact point of usage, is a helpful kind of comparison to what presence might be in the game. So that's why we're using that. So in addition to the standard tiers, there are also unusual tiers. Things like Ubers by technicality. Some Pokemon are Ubers by technicality, meaning that like typically their ability is banned, but the Pokemon themselves are not explicitly banned. But because the Pokemon doesn't have another ability, they are banned out of standard play. Other things are like ban list tiers. So if something is like not used enough to be OU, but it's clearly too good for UU, it'll get banned to UUBL. So yeah, Little Cup is a tier for little baby, not fully evolved Pokemon or first stage Pokemon. NFE is for like middle stage Pokemon. And then ZU and Untiered are kind of fan tiers. Well, ZU is a fan tier. It's not an official format usually. And then Untiered is kind of just a gutter. It's not a real tier either. It's just kind of like where Pokemon end up when they just don't belong anywhere because they're really, really, really bad. So this is the breakdown for what the Pokemon's presence will be when converting them into a Greyplains character. These are separated into the tiers. Some tiers are kind of put together into the same resulting number. I'm only looking at gens 1 through 3 generally for converting a Pokemon. So if this was going all the way up to gen 7 or even gen 5, I would move things around a little bit, maybe combine different tiers into different numbers. I'd also include things, because of tiers that don't exist, gens 1 through 4, or in the case of gen 7, gens 1 through 6. Like, there's no RU in gens 1 through 4, so therefore there's no RU in gens 1 through 3. There's also no Uber's ban list, which is occupied by Mega Rayquaza starting out in gen 7, and then other Pokemon eventually get put into it as the generations go on. So you can see for yourself how, if you look at a Pokemon that you like, you look at them on the Smogon Pokedex, you can see what their presence would be based on the tier that they're in. So, Pokemon has a really, really wide range of stats to account for, just kind of bad and good Pokemon, but also for different degrees of evolution. It's not entirely fair to compare Zigzagoon to Rayquaza. Rayquaza is a box legendary Pokemon, and Zigzagoon is a first stage, Route 1 rat. It's a raccoon, I guess, but still. And so because of that, we're going to be using stat multipliers to kind of even out the Pokemon a little bit. So that way they'll be more comparable to each other when we make a character out of them. That way, while there still be variance within the characters, there won't be like a ridiculous amount of variance where like if you want to make a Pikachu, your Pikachu is just going to have like essentially a -1 to all stats besides speed and special attack. You may have like a 0. Wow, amazing. I think Pikachu's attack is actually higher, but yeah. So, behold, these are the exact multipliers we're going to be using for the tiers. Very exciting. Pause if you want to look at them more. The metric we're going to use to determine the character's total level in Greyplains will be the Pokemon's BST, or base stat total. A base stat total can go as low as 180 in the case of Pokemon like Sunkern, and they can be as high as 680 in the case of box legendaries like Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza, Mewtwo, Lugia, Ho-Oh, things like that. In Greyplains, the character's level will range from 0 to 16, so Pokemon that have closer to 180 base stat total will be around level 0, and Pokemon that have 680 BST or close to that will be at level 16. Wow, look, another chart. Pause the video if you want to see the whole chart for longer. That's all that's on this slide. And we've done it. We have made it to roles. Ironically, roles is going to be a much faster section of the video with a lot fewer slides than stats, because this is going to be most of what the stream actually encompasses is determining the character's role and translating that role into gameplay elements. For what we're considering in Greyplains, a Pokemon's role is a combination of their type, move pool, ability, and calcs. These elements are turned into the Pokemon's set. Each Pokemon can only bring one set at a time into a Pokemon battle, and you can't run multiple Pokemon of the same species with different sets at a time. And so each Pokemon can only use one set, and these will change depending on what they're trying to accomplish. For making a Greyplains character, we might consider all of the sets when building a single character, or if there's something that's kind of outlier and very different, we might consider just that one set and build the character based on that one kind of role that it has. If a Pokemon's stats turn into their Greyplains character's abilities, then their role turns into everything else. So it'll determine their species, their level allocation. What that means is that there are 3 tiers of level allocation in Greyplains. There's the class, the archetype, and the flavor. And so generally what they're trying to accomplish will determine which levels we invest into which tier of advancement. It'll determine their features. So like that's a little bit complicated. There are all sorts of different features that come from a variety of places. It'll also determine their skills, understanding what they'll be good at and bad at, things like that. Greyplains is a complicated game. So once we understand the Pokemon's role, most of the streams will be dedicated to actually building out the character. There'll be a lot of decisions to make, especially for Pokemon that are in OU or Ubers where they have pretty high levels. It'll take a while to figure all that out. But that's also going to be the most interesting part, and the part that you, as the viewer, will get to engage with the most, so that's exciting. By the end of it, the character won't necessarily be a perfect one-to-one translation of the Pokemon as they were in Smogon, but the idea is that it'll generally have a similar role for the party, for an adventuring party, as that Pokemon served for its team. And I think the idea of a party and a team are pretty analogous to each other. If you want to participate more during the streams, the best way to do that is to A, join the stream, B, to have a copy of the Greyplains core guidebook. This way you'll be able to actually understand what's going on, you'll be able to reference the rules as they're happening, and you'll be able to make more specific suggestions based on the actual written material. You can find the Greyplains core guidebook on DriveThruRPG, searching for the Greyplains core guidebook. So, hope to see you at the stream. Thank you very much for watching. You have a nice day.